This week on the Drowsy Scribe, it's the story of how Thor loses his hammer and has to get it back by dressing up as a bride, complete with veil and wedding dress. You'll see why giants make terrible neighbors, how Loki is somehow both the problem and the solution to every problem, and that sometimes the best plan is just the most audacious one you can think of. And afterward from the scribe's bestiary, the Kraken, a sea monster so big that sailors mistook it for an island, which honestly says more about sailors' navigation skills than anything else. This is the Drowsy Scribe, Pride and Prejudice. This is a show where we take old stories, myths, legends, folklore from around the world, and retell them the way they deserve, with all the weird details intact and probably more jokes than the original audience intended. Some of these tales you've heard before, but never quite like this. Others are going to be completely new, which is half the fun. Today we're heading to Norse mythology for one of the genuinely funniest stories in the entire pantheon. And that's saying something because Norse myths get weird. This one comes from a poem called the Thrymskvida, which is part of the Poetic Edda, basically a collection of Old Norse poems that got written down in Iceland in the 13th century, though the stories themselves are way older. And this particular story answers the age-old question. What happens when the god of thunder has to go undercover? Spoiler, it involves a lot of fake jewelry and even more fake modesty. So our story starts with Thor waking up one morning in Asgard, home of the gods, and immediately knowing something is wrong. He reaches for his hammer, Mjolnir, the famous hammer, the one that can level mountains and always returns to his hand after he throws it. The hammer that's basically Thor's entire brand, and it's not there. Now, for you or me, losing something when we wake up might mean we just set it down somewhere weird the night before. Maybe we were tired. Maybe we'd had a few drinks. But for Thor, this is a catastrophic problem, because Mjolnir isn't just a weapon, it's the weapon. It's what keeps the giants from overrunning Asgard and basically ending the world. The god's entire security system is built around Thor has a hammer and he's really good at hitting things with it. So Thor does what anyone does when they've lost something important. He panics. He tears apart his room, he checks under the bed, he retraces his steps, nothing. The hammer is just gone. And that's when he goes to find Loki. Now, Loki is complicated. He's a god, sort of. He's also a giant, technically, but he lives with the gods in Asgard, and sometimes he helps them, and sometimes he causes massive problems for them, and often he does both in the same afternoon. If you had to describe him at a party, you'd probably say, it's complicated, and then change the subject. But the thing about Loki is that he's clever. Like, dangerously clever. The kind of clever where you're never quite sure if he planned the whole thing or is just really good at improvising. Thor finds Loki and says, "My hammer's gone." And Loki, to his credit, immediately understands how bad this is. "Gone? Gone?" he asks. "Or misplaced gone?" "I've looked everywhere," Thor says. "Someone took it." Now, most people would probably suggest filing a police report or checking with Lost and Found. But Loki has a different idea. "I bet it was the giants," he says. "They're always trying to get one over on us. Let me go ask around." And here's where we learn something interesting about Loki. He can borrow Freyja's cloak, which lets him fly and shapeshift. Because apparently in Norse mythology, if you're a god and you have cool magical items, you just lend them to your friends? The insurance premiums alone must be insane. Anyway, Loki puts on the feather cloak and flies off to Jotunheim, the land of the giants. And it doesn't take him long to find the culprit, because the giant responsible for the theft is just sitting there, out in the open, braiding gold into his horse's manes like he's gotten them ready for a show. His name is Thrym, which is where the poem gets its name, Thrymskvida, meaning the lay of Thrym, and he's apparently the king of the frost giants, which you'd think would make him smart enough to at least hide when he's committed a major theft. Loki lands nearby, and Thrym looks up and says, "Hey Loki, how are things in Asgard?" And Loki, who is apparently just as direct as everyone else in this story, says, "Not great. Thor's hammer is missing. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" Thrym grins. "I might," he says. "I might have hidden it 8 miles underground, where no one will ever find it." Now, you'd think this is where Loki would start negotiating, or threatening, or doing any of the clever trickster things he's famous for. But instead, he just says, "Okay, so what do you want for it?" Because apparently this is just a transaction now. Grand theft of a divine weapon? That's just the opening move in a negotiation. And Thrym says, and I need you to understand that, he says this with complete sincerity, "I want Freyja as my wife." Freyja, for context, is the goddess of love and beauty and fertility, and also war because Norse mythology doesn't believe in single-function deities. She's gorgeous, she's powerful, she has that magic cloak that Loki just borrowed, and she is absolutely, definitely not interested in marrying a giant. But Thrym doesn't seem to care about minor details like what Freyja wants. He just says, "You bring me Freyja as my bride, I'll give you the hammer back. That's the deal." Loki flies back to Asgard, probably trying to figure out how to spin this, and goes to the great hall where all the gods are gathered. Thor's there, looking miserable. Freyja's there, not yet knowing that she's about to become a bargaining chip. And Loki walks in and says, "Good news and bad news." "Start with the good news," Thor says. "I found your hammer. Thrym has it. He buried it 8 miles down. And the bad news?" Loki looks at Freyja. "He wants to marry you," he says. "That's his price." Now, there are different ways Freyja could have reacted to this. She could have been diplomatic. She could have asked questions. She could have suggested a counteroffer. Instead, she gets so angry that her necklace, this famous necklace called Bridal that she's known for wearing, just explodes off her neck. Like, the sheer force of her rage makes her jewelry detonate. "Absolutely not," she says. "I'm not marrying a giant because Thor lost his hammer. How is that even on the table as an option?" And honestly, fair point. That's completely reasonable. This is not her problem, and she's right to be furious that anyone even suggested it. But this is also where the gods start panicking, because without Mjolnir, they're defenseless. The giants could attack at any time. This is a genuine existential threat. So Heimdall, the watchman god, the one who can see everything and guards the Rainbow Bridge, speaks up. And Heimdall has an idea. It's not a good idea, but it's an idea. "What if," he says slowly, "we dress Thor up as Freyja?" There's a long silence. "I'm sorry," Thor says. "What?" "Think about it." Heimdall continues, getting into it now. "Thrym wants a bride. We send him a bride. He gives back the hammer. The bride is actually you, Thor. Once you have Mjolnir back, you just take care of the problem." "You want me," Thor says, the god of thunder, "to dress up as a woman and marry a giant, just temporarily?" Thor looks around the room for support, but all the other gods are suddenly very interested in the ceiling, the floor, literally anywhere else. "I'll be a laughingstock," Thor says. "Everyone will make fun of me forever." And Loki, beautiful, terrible Loki, says, "Sure, but you'll be a laughingstock with your hammer. Without it, you'll be a dead laughingstock, because the giants will kill all of us." Which is a compelling argument, really. Thor tries one more time. "Can't we just go to war? Fight our way in? Get the hammer back?" "It's 8 miles underground," Loki points out. "You'd need Mjolnir to dig that fast. See the problem?" So Thor, with all the enthusiasm of someone going to the dentist, agrees to the plan. And the gods get to work. They dress him in a wedding dress, a full bridal gown with all the trimmings. They put a veil over his face, because obviously they need to hide his beard, which is magnificent and also a dead giveaway. They drape him in jewelry, including Freyja's necklace Bridal, which has presumably been repaired after the whole explosion incident. They put a big ring of keys at his belt, because apparently that's what brides wore to show they were going to run the household. And Thor just stands there, radiating humiliation while the gods fuss over him like he's going to prom. "How do I look?" he asks, and his voice is flat. "Beautiful," Loki says, not even trying to hide his grin. "Thrym won't suspect a thing." "I hate this," Thor says. "I know," Loki says. "That's what makes it so great." And then Loki adds, "Oh, by the way, I'm coming with you, as your bridesmaid." "My what?" "Every bride needs a bridesmaid," Loki says cheerfully. "Someone to help you through the ceremony, answer any tricky questions, that sort of thing, and you're clearly gonna need the help." Thor looks like he wants to argue, but honestly, Loki's not wrong. There's no way Thor can pull this off alone. Thor's strategy for most problems is hit it with a hammer. He's not exactly built for subterfuge. So the two of them climb into a chariot pulled by Thor's goats. Yes, goats. Thor has magic goats that pull his chariot. Just go with it, and off they go to Jotunheim. The journey is apparently so intense that sparks fly and the earth shakes and mountains split apart, which seems excessive for what's essentially a road trip to a wedding, but this is Norse mythology, and nothing happens quietly. When they arrive at Thrym's hall, the giant king is thrilled. He's prepared a whole feast. He's invited all his giant friends and relatives. He's basically thrown the wedding of the century, and his bride, well, the person he thinks is his bride, has actually shown up. "Bring out the food," Thrym shouts. "Bring out the drink. Tonight I marry Freyja." the most beautiful goddess in all of Asgard. They sit down to the feast, and this is where things get tricky, because Thor needs to maintain his cover, and Thor is not good at subtlety. The servants bring out the food, and Thor, who is always hungry, because he's Thor, immediately starts eating. He eats an entire ox by himself, then he eats 8 salmon, then he eats all the delicacies that were specifically set aside for the women. The giants are starting to stare. Thrym leans over to Loki, who's sitting there in his own bridesmaid disguise, and whispers, "I've never seen a woman eat that much!" And Loki, without missing a beat, says, "Oh, Freyja was so excited to meet you that she hasn't eaten in 8 days. She's been fasting out of anticipation." Which is a wild thing to say, but Thrym just nods like this makes perfect sense. 8 days, he says. She must really love me. Then Thor grabs a horn of mead and drinks it all in one go. Then he drinks 2 more. Thrym's looking concerned again. "I've never seen a woman drink that much either," he says. Loki leans in. "She hasn't had anything to drink in 8 days either. Same reason. Excited to meet you. You know how it is." Thrym is clearly a little confused about why someone excited for their wedding would engage in a week-long fast that apparently includes liquids, but he's too pleased with himself to question it too hard. Then, and this is where Thrym makes his big mistake, he decides he wants to kiss his bride. He leans forward and lifts the veil just a little to sneak a peek, and he sees Thor's eyes glaring back at him. Thrym literally jumps backward. "Her eyes!" he shouts. "They're like fire! Why are her eyes so angry?" And Loki, who at this point must be having the time of his life, says smoothly, "She hasn't slept in 8 nights. She's been so excited to come here and marry you that she couldn't sleep at all. That's just exhaustion you're seeing." Now, let's pause here and appreciate what Loki's done. He's now established that Freyja is so wildly in love with Thrym that she's spent over a week refusing to eat, drink, or sleep. That's not romance. That's a medical emergency. But Thrym is eating it up, pun intended, because he's apparently been hitting the mead pretty hard himself, and also because he's a giant, and giants in Norse mythology are generally not known for their critical thinking skills. Thrym's sister shows up at this point. She's been at the feast the whole time, but now she walks over and says, "So, about my wedding gift." Because apparently she expects a bride price, which was a traditional thing the bride's family would give gifts to the groom's family, and vice versa. "If you want my goodwill," the sister says, "I'm going to need some of those golden rings you're wearing." And Thor, who hasn't spoken this entire time because his voice would immediately give him away, just sits there radiating murderous intent through his veil. Loki subtly kicks him under the table, but Thrym waves his sister away. Later, he says, "First, let's finish the ceremony. Bring out the hammer." And this is it. This is the moment they've been waiting for. Because apparently the wedding ceremony requires the hammer to be placed in the bride's lap as a blessing. It's a fertility thing, a consecration of the marriage, which means Thrym is about to hand Thor the one thing Thor's been after this entire time. The giants bring out Mjolnir, and you can practically feel Thor's relief even through the veil. They lay the hammer in Freyja's lap. Thrym stands up, spreading his arms wide. "Now," he says grandly, "let us bind our union, bring together the giants and the Asgardians in marriage and peace." And Thor wraps his hand around Mjolnir's handle and stands up. And you know what happens next? The first thing Thor does is kill Thrym. Just boom. One hit. The giant king who stole his hammer and thought he could extort the gods into giving him a wife goes down immediately. Then Thor goes after Thrym's sister, the one who wanted the golden rings. She gets the same treatment. Then he starts working his way through the rest of the giants in the hall. And this is the part where the comedy ends, and the Old Norse violence takes over. Because Thor doesn't just defeat them, he wipes them out. The poem says he kills all of the giants' kin, which is a polite way of saying he murders everyone at the wedding. Is it overkill? Probably. Is it excessive? Definitely. But this is Thor we're talking about. He's not known for proportional responses. Someone steals his hammer and tries to force a goddess into marriage. Everyone at that party is complicit as far as Thor is concerned. When the dust settles, and there's a lot of dust, because Mjolnir doesn't do anything halfway, Thor and Loki leave. They get back in the goat chariot, presumably with Thor still in the wedding dress because the poem doesn't mention him changing, and they head back to Asgard. And when they arrive, the other gods are waiting anxiously to see if the plan worked. Thor tosses Mjolnir up and catches it, letting the hammer's weight settle in his hand. "Got it back," he says. Everyone cheers. "How'd it go?" someone asks. "Don't ask," Thor says. He heads off to his room, presumably to burn the wedding dress and never speak of this again. But Loki is absolutely going to tell this story at every possible opportunity for the rest of time. You just know he is. This is the kind of dirt you save for special occasions. Bad day? Tell the story about how Thor dressed up as a bride. Someone getting too full of themselves? Remind them about the time the god of thunder wore a veil and jewelry and sat through an entire feast pretending to be Freyja. And that's the story. Thor got his hammer back. Thrym and his entire wedding party are dead. And somewhere in Asgard, there's a wedding dress that's probably been relegated to the very back of someone's closet where no one will ever look at it again. So here's the thing about the Thrymskvida. It's one of those myths that's just fun. Like, Norse mythology has a reputation for being all doom and gloom and Ragnarok and the end of the world, and sure, there's plenty of that. But then you've got stories like this one, where the solution to a divine crisis is, what if the big strong god put on a dress? And somehow it works. The poem itself is pretty short, only about 32 stanzas, but it's packed with comedy. Scholars think it might have been a later addition to the mythology, possibly written during the Christian period in Iceland, partly because the humor feels more self-aware than some of the older, more serious myths. But honestly, I think the Norse just appreciated a good joke, and the image of Thor, the guy who's basically the embodiment of hit things until they stop being a problem, having to sit through a wedding feast and pretend to be a demure bride, is objectively hilarious. Plus, there's something weirdly satisfying about Loki and Thor working together for once. Usually, Loki's causing problems and Thor's solving them by hitting Loki. But here they're a team, and Loki's quick thinking is the only reason the plan works at all. Thor would have blown his cover in the first 30 seconds without Loki running interference. The moral of the story, if there is one? Sometimes the best solution to a problem is the one that nobody would ever expect because it's too ridiculous to consider. Also, don't steal from the gods. They will get their stuff back, and you will regret it. And now for something from the scribe's bestiary, the Kraken. So you know how every culture that lives near the ocean eventually develops a legend about some massive sea creature that will absolutely ruin your day? The Kraken is Scandinavia's contribution to that tradition, and it's a good one. The Kraken shows up in Norwegian and Icelandic folklore as a sea monster of truly ridiculous proportions. We're talking so big that sailors would mistake it for an island. Which raises the question, how bad were medieval navigation techniques that people kept trying to land on sea monsters? But anyway, the earliest written accounts of the Kraken come from the 13th century, around the same time period when a lot of Norse myths were being written down. In a Norwegian text called the King's Mirror, there's a description of a creature called the Hafgufa, which means sea mist, that's so large it looks like multiple islands rising from the water. The text helpfully notes that there are probably only 2 of these things in the world because the ocean couldn't sustain more than that, which is reassuring, I guess. By the 18th century, when naturalists were trying to catalog every living thing, the Kraken made it into actual scientific texts. A Danish bishop named Pontoppidan wrote about it in his Natural History of Norway and described it as being 1.5 miles in diameter. That's not a typo. 1.5 miles. He claimed that when it surfaced, it created whirlpools that could drag ships down, and when it dove back down, the suction was strong enough to pull anything nearby into the depths. But here's the interesting part. Pontoppidan also said that fishermen would actually seek out the Kraken, because where the Kraken was, the fishing was amazing. The theory was that the Kraken's waste products, because yes, we're talking about monster poop, would attract smaller fish, which would attract bigger fish, and suddenly you've got this incredible fishing spot, just, also a sea monster. The downside, if you were fishing above the Kraken and it decided to surface, you were done. Game over. No second chances. Later descriptions of the Kraken gave it tentacles. This is probably where the confusion with giant squids comes in. And actually, giant squids are probably the real-world basis for at least some of the Kraken stories. Giant squids can grow up to 43 feet long, which is definitely tell stories about it at the tavern territory, even if it's not quite mistake it for an island territory. But the legendary Kraken kept getting bigger and bigger with each retelling. By the time you get to Tennyson's poem in the 1800s, the Kraken is this ancient thing sleeping at the bottom of the ocean, waiting until the end of the world to rise up. Which is very dramatic, but also kind of a letdown, right? This massive creature exists but only shows up for the apocalypse. That's like being invited to a party that only happens once, and it's literally the worst party ever. Modern depictions of the Kraken usually split the difference. Sometimes it's a giant squid, sometimes it's more of a kraken with a lowercase k, some undefined cephalopod monster. Pirates of the Caribbean gave us a kraken that's basically a pet for Davy Jones, which raises all sorts of questions about marine biology and also what you feed a creature that size. The point is, the kraken occupies this interesting space in folklore where it's simultaneously terrifying and kind of ridiculous. It's a monster so big that it creates its own ecosystem, so big that people mistake it for land, so big that its bathroom habits create fishing hotspots. That's not just scary, that's weird. And honestly, that's why it's lasted. The kraken isn't just another sea serpent, it's excessive. It's the ocean saying, you think you know what big is? You don't know what big is. It's nature's way of keeping sailors humble, or at least keeping them away from suspicious-looking islands that smell like fish. And that's our show for this week. We've learned that sometimes the best disguise is the most obvious one, that Loki should probably be your first call in a crisis, and that if you're going to steal from a god, maybe have an exit strategy better than, I'll just tell them what I want in exchange. If you've got a myth or legend you'd like to hear on the show, send it my way. I'm always looking for stories where the solution to the problem is somehow weirder than the problem itself. Until next time, keep your hammers close, your trickster friends closer, and maybe don't accept wedding invitations from giants. The Drowsy Scribe, signing off.